Dog refuses to leave. Crying baby in the park. What the camera captured will bring you to tears. Tomas's cries echoed across the park, sharp and urgent. His small hands flailed in the grass and his tiny legs kicked at the air as he struggled to sit up. The stroller, once filled with his toys and blanket, was now empty, abandoned just a few feet away. His mother, Isabel, had turned her back for only a moment, distracted by a phone call. Now her baby was alone. With each passing second, Tomas's sobs grew louder, but there was no one around to hear. The park, usually filled with families and laughter, felt eerily quiet. The few people who passed by were too absorbed in their own worlds to notice the abandoned child. Dante, a scruffy German shepherd with matted fur, was scouring the park in search of food. His bones ached from hunger, but his instincts told him to keep moving. He had been on his own for months, drifting from one corner of the city to another, but tonight, something drew him to the playground. The soft wail of the baby broke through his hunger-driven haze. Dante's ears pricked up. His tired eyes scanned the area, and there, beneath the swing set lying on the grass, was the source of the sound. At first, he stayed back, wary of the stranger. But as the cries continued, something shifted in him. He moved closer, cautiously at first, sniffing the air. His nose twitched. There, in front of him, was a helpless child, no older than a year, lost in the vastness of the park. The baby's small face, streaked with tears, caught Dante's attention. There was something in the way Tomas looked up at him, vulnerable, desperate, that pulled at the dog's heart. Dante approached, hesitant but drawn to the infant's distress. With a soft whine, he lay down beside Tomas, his body shielding the baby from the cold evening air. The child's cries slowed as he reached out, fingers brushing Dante's fur. For a moment, it was as if the world had stopped. Dante, once a stray with no home or purpose, now found himself responsible for something or someone in need. He stayed by Tomas's side, refusing to leave. No one had come for the child yet, and for reasons Dante couldn't quite explain, he wasn't going to let anyone hurt him. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Tomas, still curled up on the ground, sniffled softly. His small body shivered under the cool night air. Dante remained by his side, his fur pressed protectively against the child. He didn't fully understand what had drawn him here, or why he had chosen to stay, but instinct told him one thing: he couldn't leave. Dante shifted slightly, his eyes darting around the park. The empty benches, the distant sounds of laughter, the soft rustle of trees in the wind, all seemed far away now. His world had narrowed down to one thing: the baby at his side. The crying had stopped for a moment, replaced by quiet sniffles as Tomas's small hand reached out again, groping for comfort. Dante's body stiffened for a split second, unsure of what to do. But then the child's tiny fingers brushed against his coat, and a wave of calm washed over the dog. It was as if Tomas had accepted him, even without words. It was a strange, powerful moment, a bond forged in silence and vulnerability. The park, once bustling with people, now felt entirely empty, as if the world itself had paused to witness this unlikely connection. Dante looked up at the empty space around them, his keen eyes searching for any signs of help. But there was no one. No sign of Tomas's parents, no rescuers, no one who would come for the baby in time. The night was growing colder, and the dog knew that without intervention the situation would soon take a darker turn. Dante lowered his head to the ground, resting his chin on the grass, watching Tomas as he fell into a fitful sleep. The baby's chest rose and fell, his small body curled against the warmth Dante offered. But the peace was fragile. Every so often the baby would stir, his eyes fluttering open to check that the protector was still there. And each time, Dante would softly nudge him, reassuring him with a gentle growl. He was here and he wasn't going anywhere. Hours passed and still no one came. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a faint light over the park. Dante's stomach growled, a reminder of his own hunger, but he ignored it. There were more important things now. He had a responsibility, one that felt both strange and natural, all at once. His worn paws itched to move, to run, but Dante stayed still, watching over Tomas. It wasn't until a muffled voice called out in the distance that Dante finally lifted his head, his ears perking up. For a brief moment, hope surged through him. Could it be someone coming to help? Could it be Tomas's mother? The distant voice grew louder, but Dante didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Tomas, whose small form was now nestled against him, asleep but still vulnerable. The sound of footsteps approaching echoed through the park, faint but growing nearer with each passing moment. But Dante remained motionless, unwilling to leave the child's side. It wasn't until a figure appeared in the distance that Dante finally stirred. The woman, frantic and disoriented, was running toward the playground, her face twisted in worry. Her hands reached out, her voice shaking as she called Tomas's name over and over. Isabel had been searching for what felt like hours, her heart racing in panic. She had turned her back for just a moment, just a second, but it was enough for her baby to slip away from her sight. The park, once a place of relaxation and joy, had turned into a nightmare. Now her worst fear was realized. Tomas was gone. The woman's breath hitched as she scanned the area, her eyes desperately searching for any sign of her son. Her mind raced through every possibility, her thoughts spiraling into panic. What if something had happened to him? What if? Then she saw it. Dante was lying beside Tomas, his large body shielding the baby. The dog's gaze was calm but alert, his ears twitching at the sound of her approach. Isabel's legs gave way, and she stumbled toward them, her voice cracking as she called out for her child. "Tomas! Tomas!" Dante's eyes flickered in her direction, his posture stiffening, but he didn't growl or retreat. He stayed where he was, protectively watching over the child. Isabel stopped in her tracks when she saw him. Her mind raced. Was this dog a threat? Was he guarding her baby or something else? But then she saw it in the dog's eyes. There was no aggression, no menace, just loyalty. Isabel knelt down beside Tomas, her hands trembling as she scooped him up. He stirred, groggily waking to the sound of his mother's voice. Her arms enveloped him, holding him close as tears began to fall freely. The relief was overwhelming, and for a moment, she just held him, thanking the universe for bringing her son back to her. But her eyes never left the dog. Dante remained still, watching them both. His ears perked slightly as if waiting for her next move, but he didn't step forward. His job for now was done. Isabel gently placed Tomas back in his stroller, never breaking her gaze from the dog. The bond between them was undeniable. He had stayed with her baby through the long, lonely hours of the night, offering comfort when no one else was around. She stood up, wiping away the tears that blurred her vision, and approached Dante slowly. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, Isabel found herself feeling grateful for something beyond human help. For a dog, a stray, who had been there when no one else was. She held out her hand, not in fear, but in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Dante didn't move. He only watched her with quiet understanding, his loyalty clear in the way he stayed rooted in place. For now, he was done. He had done what he needed to do. The sound of police sirens filled the air as Isabel slowly wheeled Tomas toward the park's entrance. Her mind was still clouded with fear, her heart pounding with both relief and lingering anxiety. She kept glancing over her shoulder at the dog, Dante, who remained in place by the playground. His presence lingered in her mind, his quiet watchfulness a strange comfort, but also an unanswered question. Who was he? Why had he stayed? The officers were quick to respond, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the deserted park. As Isabel relayed the situation to them, describing the terrifying moments she had spent searching for Tomas, she couldn't shake the image of Dante's gaze from her mind. There was something deeply unsettling about the fact that no one had noticed the dog before, yet here he was, a guardian who had stepped in when no one else could. The officers assured Isabel that they would look into it. She appreciated their efforts, but her focus remained fixed on the dog. Was he a stray with no owner, or was there a story behind him? She hadn't heard a single bark of aggression, only calm, unwavering attention to Tomas. It was as though he had understood the baby's distress and had responded with an instinctive protectiveness that defied all logic. But she couldn't stay there forever. Her thoughts were interrupted as one of the officers approached her, shaking his head. "There's no sign of anyone else around," he said. "We've asked some of the regulars who visit here, but no one has seen anything unusual." His voice trailed off as he glanced toward the spot where Dante had been. "He's just gone," the officer continued, almost as if speaking to himself. He motioned toward the empty playground, now still and quiet. Isabel turned her attention back to the stroller. Tomas was dozing, his small hands clutching the edges of his blanket. Her heart swelled with gratitude. Gratitude for the dog that had kept him safe, even if only for a few hours. But where had Dante gone? She looked around the park, searching for the dog, but there was no sign of him. The tension from earlier had dissipated with Tomas's safety, but now another feeling began to creep in: emptiness. The park had returned to its peaceful state, but the absence of Dante felt like a missing piece. It was as if he had been part of something bigger, something she couldn't quite explain. Just as she was about to turn toward her car, a small noise caught her attention. She froze. It wasn't far off, just behind a row of trees near the park's edge, the familiar rustling sound of leaves in the wind. But something else. A soft whine. Dante. Isabel's breath caught in her chest, and her feet moved before her mind could catch up. She had to know. She had to see him again. She pushed the stroller forward, urgency setting in, and followed the sound. Isabel's footsteps quickened as she moved toward the source of the sound. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of her gratitude for Dante was anchoring her to the ground. Her eyes darted through the darkened park, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had to see him again. She had to make sure he was okay. The soft rustle of leaves grew louder, and she rounded the corner of the tree line. There, just out of sight, Dante stood. His head was low, eyes scanning the ground in front of him, his posture tense, but he wasn't moving. His gaze shifted slightly when Isabel appeared, and for a moment their eyes locked. There was no hostility, no fear, only recognition. Isabel slowed her pace, not wanting to startle him. She had no idea what had driven him to stay with Tomas. But in that moment, she realized that he wasn't just a stray dog. He had become something more, a silent protector, a guardian who had made a choice. A choice to stay with a helpless child, even when the world had ignored him. "Dante," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog didn't respond immediately, but he didn't move either. He simply watched her, his eyes full of an understanding that reached far beyond words. Isabel felt a lump form in her throat, and she instinctively reached out as if trying to bridge the gap between them. There was no rational explanation for the bond that had formed between them in such a short time, but it was there, undeniable. Isabel knelt down slowly so as not to frighten him. "Thank you," she said again, her voice cracking. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she could offer. Dante didn't move closer, but his gaze softened, and Isabel saw something in his eyes, an acceptance. She had given him nothing, but a few quiet words, yet somehow he understood. He had done what he had needed to do. His role in Tomas's life had been brief, but it was enough. In a way, it had changed everything. The weight of the night's events began to settle on Isabel. She looked at Tomas, who was still resting in his stroller, unaware of the quiet exchange happening just a few feet away. Her baby was safe, and for that, she would be forever grateful. But now she couldn't ignore the truth. Dante had been the reason Tomas was safe. Isabel stood up, taking a step toward him, but Dante backed away slightly. It wasn't rejection, it was distance. He had given what he could, and now he was ready to go. She felt a pang in her chest, as though the dog's departure would leave an emptiness she couldn't fill. But she couldn't keep him. He wasn't hers to keep, and somehow she knew he needed to leave on his own terms, just as he had come. She paused, her hand outstretched, but she didn't try to approach him further. "Goodbye, Dante," she said softly, watching him retreat into the shadows of the park. His figure grew smaller as he disappeared between the trees, until there was nothing left but the faint sound of his footsteps fading away. She stood there, for a long moment, trying to reconcile the strange, deep connection she'd felt with a dog who had been a stranger to her just hours ago. The night felt quieter now, the tension of the past hours dissipating with each passing second. But somewhere deep inside, Isabel knew that the memory of Dante would remain with her forever. The next few days passed in a blur for Isabel. Her life, once consumed by the panic of Tomas's disappearance, had slowly returned to normal. She had returned to her daily routines, grocery shopping, taking Tomas to his pediatrician, and watching him crawl around the house with unbridled curiosity. She had never appreciated those small moments more, but despite the relief, there was something in the back of her mind that wouldn't let her go. Dante, his face, his eyes, and the quiet way he had protected Tomas still haunted her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something for him, something to show her gratitude, to make sure he was okay. Isabel had tried asking around the neighborhood, speaking to locals about any sightings of a stray dog matching Dante's description, but each time she came up empty-handed. It was as though he had vanished, leaving no trace of where he might have gone. She couldn't understand how a dog like him, one so capable of love and loyalty, could disappear without a trace. One afternoon, she found herself standing in front of the local animal shelter, the place she had never visited before. She had told herself she would find Dante, that he had to be somewhere, and this was the only place she hadn't checked. The shelter was small but clean, a place where stray dogs and cats were brought in to be cared for and, if lucky, adopted. Isabel walked through the door, her heart pounding. The noise of barking dogs greeted her, but she wasn't distracted. She walked to the front desk, her eyes scanning the rows of cages lined against the walls. "Can I help you?" the attendant asked, her voice kind but neutral. "I'm looking for a dog," Isabel replied, her throat tightening. "He's a German shepherd, scruffy, a bit worn. His name is Dante." The woman looked thoughtful for a moment, then shook her head. "We don't have a dog by that name, but I can check for any German shepherds we've taken in recently. Is he a lost pet?" Isabel hesitated. Could she really explain? Could she tell this woman about the bond Dante had shared with her son? About the quiet, heroic acts of protection that had kept Tomas safe? She didn't know if it would make sense to anyone else. "No," she said softly. "He wasn't lost. He found us." The woman seemed to understand, offering a reassuring smile before leading Isabel to the back. They passed through a hallway filled with kennels, each one containing a dog that had been rescued, abandoned, or surrendered. Most of them wagged their tails at the sight of Isabel, but none of them was Dante. Her chest tightened with each passing cage. "Do you have any dogs that might be new arrivals?" Isabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The attendant nodded and led her to a small pen near the back. The dogs inside looked up as she approached, some wagging their tails, others sniffing at the ground. And there, sitting alone in the shy corner, was a familiar figure. Dante. He looked thinner than before, his fur matted and tangled, but his eyes, the same deep, knowing eyes, met hers across the room. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if time had frozen again, just like it had in the park that night. Isabel took a hesitant step forward. Dante's ears perked up, but he didn't stand. His gaze never left her, and she could feel the connection between them pulling her closer. "Dante," she whispered, her voice breaking with relief. The tears she had held back for so long began to spill, but this time they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of joy. The attendant smiled knowingly, stepping back. "He's been here for a few days now," she said softly. We were just about to try and find him a new home, but it looks like he's already found his. Isabel knelt down at the gate, reaching through the bars. Dante stood up slowly, his body stiff but his tail giving a small wag. He came closer, sniffing her hand before gently nuzzling it with his nose. Isabel's heart swelled. "I should have come sooner," she murmured. "I should have found you sooner." But Dante didn't seem to mind. He stood there quietly, accepting her presence. And in that moment, Isabel knew she wasn't just bringing him home for her. She was bringing him home for Tomas. Dante had been a guardian, and now he would be, a part of their family, the protector who had saved her son when no one else had been there. With a final glance at the attendant, Isabel stood up and unlocked the pen. She opened the door, and Dante stepped out, his body brushing against her leg as if to say, "I'm here." And so together, they walked out of the shelter, two beings who had found each other, two hearts forever changed. Isabel didn't hesitate. She knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, she unlocked the pen's gate and stepped inside. Dante's gaze followed her every movement, but he didn't back away. The time they'd spent apart had only deepened the bond between them. She knelt down in front of him, feeling the weight of the moment settle around them both. "You saved him," Isabel whispered, her voice full of quiet gratitude. "You kept him safe." Dante, as if he understood, gave a small whine, his tail giving a tentative wag. Isabel's heart fluttered. She reached out to stroke his head, the rough texture of his fur a reminder of everything they had gone through together. In that moment, she knew that there was no question. He belonged with her now, with them. The attendant, watching the scene unfold, stepped back, giving them space. "I'll get the paperwork ready," she said quietly. "It's clear he's already chosen." Isabel nodded, wiping away the tear that had escaped. She hadn't expected to feel this overwhelmed, this sense of relief, as though a piece of her life had been returned to her. Tomas was already in the stroller outside, waiting, blissfully unaware of the moment unfolding inside the shelter. But Isabel knew that everything was about to change. Dante had become more than a dog to her. He was part of their story now. He had stepped into their lives at a moment of deep uncertainty and had proven himself as something far greater than just a stray animal. He had been the unsung hero of the darkest night, the silent protector of her son, and now he would be the steady presence they both needed. She gently clipped the leash to his collar, and with one last lingering look at the shelter, they walked out together. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Isabel could feel the weight of the world lifting off her shoulders with every step she took toward her car. Dante trotted by her side, his pace steady and calm. They had been through so much in such a short time, yet somehow, it felt like they had been connected for years. She could see the protective glint in his eyes, a silent promise that he would always be there for Tomas, for her. When they reached the car, Isabel stopped for a moment, glancing at her son in the stroller. Tomas was asleep, his small fingers clutching the edge of his blanket. She smiled softly and then turned her attention back to Dante, who was standing patiently beside her, waiting for the next step. As she opened the car door, she looked down at him one last time. "You're home now, Dante," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "You're part of our family." Dante's tail wagged once, and it was as if he understood. In the quiet space between them, something unspoken passed. A mutual understanding that they were no longer strangers. They were connected in a way that transcended words. Isabel slid into the driver's seat and carefully buckled Tomas into his car seat. She glanced at Dante as he settled into the back seat, his eyes soft and watchful, the weight of his quiet presence filling the space. The car hummed to life, and they began the drive back home. Home now with Dante, their new protector and companion. The road ahead felt different now. Every mile, every turn felt as though it was leading to something better, something full of hope and love. Isabel couldn't help but think that perhaps in saving Tomas, Dante had saved her too. He had filled the empty spaces in her heart, brought her peace, and shown her that sometimes the greatest heroes didn't wear capes. They wore fur and had hearts full of unconditional loyalty. As they drove toward their home, the evening sky stretched out in front of them, a deep blue canvas dotted with stars. And in the back seat, Dante sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as though he too understood that they were embarking on a new journey together, one where love, protection, and family would always be at the center. Isabel couldn't wait to see what the future held, but for the first time in a long while she felt ready for it, because with Dante by their side, she knew they could face anything. The house felt different that evening. It wasn't the creak of the floorboards or the hum of the refrigerator, but something deeper, something more subtle. The air seemed to hold an unfamiliar warmth, as if the very walls were wrapping themselves around them, welcoming Dante into their lives. Isabel stood at the threshold of her living room, watching Tomas in his playpen, and Dante at her feet, his eyes following her every movement. It was peaceful. There was an unspoken understanding in the air, a quiet connection that seemed to fill the empty spaces in her heart. A part of her had always felt that something was missing, something she couldn't name. But now, with Dante in the house, that feeling was gone. There was no longer an emptiness, just a sense of completeness she had never expected. She glanced down at him, watching as he lay by her feet, his head resting on his paws. The room was still, but it was also full of life in a way that it hadn't been before. Isabel felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. She had been scared that she had lost something precious in Tomas, scared that life had somehow slipped beyond her control. But Dante had restored that sense of safety, of protection, that had been so desperately needed. Tomas giggled from the playpen, reaching out for a toy just beyond his grasp. His tiny hand swiped the air, his eyes sparkling with determination. Isabel's heart swelled as she walked over to him, lifting him into her arms. She kissed the top of his head, the soft sound of his laughter filling her ears. As she sat down on the couch with Tomas in her lap, Dante slowly rose from his spot on the floor and padded over to them. He sat quietly beside her, as if instinctively, knowing that this was the family he had sworn to protect. Isabel could feel the weight of his loyalty, even without a word being spoken. It was as if Dante had chosen them, not just for his need for shelter, but because he understood something about family, about the unspoken bond that tied them together. Isabel stroked his fur absent-mindedly as Tomas leaned into her, his little hands pulling at her shirt. The comfort in the moment was almost overwhelming. The peaceful stillness of the house contrasted with the chaos that had nearly consumed her in those few dark hours before. But now, everything felt different. Everything felt right. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was thanking. Her words could be for Dante, for Tomas, for the universe that had brought them all together. It didn't matter. She just needed to say it. Dante, as always, remained silent, his gaze steady and calm. He seemed to understand that sometimes words weren't necessary. The bond they shared was deeper than any language, any spoken promise. It was the kind of bond that could only exist between a mother, a child, and the protector who had stood between them and the darkness, even when no one else had noticed. The quiet moments that followed felt like eternity. Isabel watched Tomas, who was now happily distracted with his toys, and then Dante, who lay by the couch, still watching them both with an unwavering, gentle attention. She thought about the future, about the life they would build now, the memories they would create together. There would be challenges, of course, but in that moment she felt ready for them. She wasn't alone anymore. Dante had proven, in the most unimaginable way, that sometimes the greatest love didn't come from the people closest to us, but from those who chose to love us despite everything. Dante had chosen them, had become their guardian when they needed him most, and now he was part of the family. And Isabel knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. As she leaned back into the couch, holding Tomas, close and feeling the warmth of Dante beside her, she closed her eyes, allowing the peace to wash over her. This moment was the beginning of something beautiful, something whole. And in her heart, Isabel knew it was just the start of a new chapter for them all. Dante, their silent guardian, had brought them home, and now they were exactly where they were meant to be. The days grew warmer as spring began to settle into the small town, and life carried on in its usual rhythm. The quiet hum of routine, waking up, feeding Tomas, taking him to the park, became a dance of simplicity and joy. But even in the most ordinary moments, Isabel couldn't help but marvel at how everything had changed. The presence of Dante in their home had filled every corner with a new sense of peace. It wasn't just his loyalty or his calm demeanor. It was the understanding he brought, the silent assurance that he was always watching over them, guarding them in ways words couldn't express. He had saved Tomas, but in a way he had saved Isabel too. He had healed something inside her, a wound she hadn't even known was there. It was late one afternoon when Isabel stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. Tomas was in his playpen, babbling as he reached for his toys, his giggles filling the space. Dante lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never strayed far from her. The light through the window bathed the room in a soft golden glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out into the future. For a moment, Isabel paused, her knife hovering mid-air as the weight of it all settled in. She was no longer living in fear of what might happen tomorrow. She wasn't consumed by the chaos of what had been. They were safe, they were together, and most importantly, they were loved. "Come here, baby," she said gently, her voice a soft whisper as she looked over at Tomas. He crawled over to her with his usual determination, his tiny hands reaching for her legs, his bright eyes full of curiosity. Isabel scooped him up, holding him close as he snuggled into her chest, his warmth a reminder of the miracle that had brought them all together. Dante lifted his head, as if acknowledging the moment, and moved closer, resting his chin on Isabel's lap. His eyes, steady and calm, met hers. She smiled down at him, the corners of her mouth curling into a genuine, grateful smile. In that smile was everything she couldn't put into words, the depth of her appreciation, the peace he had brought into her life, and the love that had grown between them. Quiet, but strong. "Your family now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Always." Dante didn't respond with words, but the look in his eyes was more than enough. There was no question. He had found his place in the world, and it was with them. Through everything they had been through the fear and uncertainty, they had found something real, something lasting, a bond forged in the heat of the moment, but one that would last a lifetime. As the evening settled in, Isabel carried Tomas into the living room, Dante following close behind. She sat down on the couch, cradling Tomas in her arms as he yawned, his eyelids fluttering in the quiet comfort of the evening. Dante curled up at their feet, settling in for the night. Isabel looked at her son, at the dog who had become their protector, their silent hero. In that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. There was no more searching, no more wondering. They had found each other, and that was enough. The world outside might be unpredictable, full of challenges and heartache, but here, in this small corner of the world, they were safe. They were together, and in the quiet stillness of the night, as the stars began to twinkle outside, Isabel knew this was just the beginning of their story. The journey they had begun that night in the park had led them to this place, a home filled with love, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow. And no matter what the future held, she would always be grateful for the stray dog who had chosen them, who had saved them, and who in return had become a part of their family forever. Dante had come to them in the darkest moment of their lives, and now he would stay always by their side, a silent guardian, a friend, and a family member. And with that thought, Isabel finally allowed herself to rest, knowing they had everything they needed, each other. Sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the ones we dream of, but the ones who show up in our darkest hours, when we need them the most. Dante wasn't just a dog. He was the answer to a silent fear, the light in a moment of darkness, and proof that even when everything seems lost, true strength lies in loyalty and unconditional love. He reminds us that the deepest connections don't need words, just presence. And have you ever found an unexpected hero in your life? Share in the comments how someone or something changed your story in surprising ways. If this journey of love, protection, and overcoming adversity touched you, don't forget to like and share this video so we can spread this message of hope. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Join us and become part of a community that believes in the power of love and the bonds that bring us together. Let's walk this path together, because stories like this deserve to be lived and remembered.